Everyone laughed at him. The rich guests whispered behind his back, mocking the stains on his shirt, the cracks in his hands, the wear on his shoes. To them, he was just the dishwasher, a man too poor to sit at their table, too invisible to matter. No one cared that he was a father. No one cared why he worked double shifts, stayed silent, and took the insults with bowed head and tired eyes. But they all cared the night the pianist didn't show up. That's when the dishwasher quietly walked over to the grand piano, sat down. And within seconds, the room froze. Conversation stopped. Forks clinked to a halt. Even the manager stared, speechless. Because the same man they mocked was now playing with the elegance of a master, not for applause, but for his daughter, who was turning 8 and had never heard her father play. That night, the same guests who ridiculed him were on their feet, clapping with tears in their eyes. But it wasn't just music. It was a reminder of how little we know about the people we judge. And how sometimes, the most broken hands create the most beautiful things. Marcus had been part of the background for so long that most people never really saw him. He moved like a whisper through the upscale southern restaurant, shoulders slightly hunched, head down, hands always busy. The staff knew him as the man who never missed a shift, who came in early and stayed late, who scrubbed until the metal counters gleamed and the sinks never backed up. He didn't talk much. He didn't complain. He simply worked. To the guests, those neatly dressed in designer jackets and expensive shoes, who sipped imported wines and asked for steaks medium rare, he was invisible. Just another dishwasher in the back. Just another man whose name wasn't worth remembering. And that suited Marcus just fine. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that he had once been someone. Not someone rich or famous, but someone with dreams bigger than the 4 walls of a kitchen. A boy from Decatur who could read music before he could properly write his name. A teenager who once filled church halls with the kind of piano melodies that made elders cry and strangers ask, "Who taught you to play like that?" But life had a way of changing course without warning. And when his wife's diagnosis came, stage 3 ovarian cancer, it was like the music stopped. Overnight, everything became about survival. Medical bills, food, rent, childcare. The piano was sold within a week. The music was shelved for later. Later never came. Now, every morning, Marcus took 2 buses to get to the restaurant. He wore the same shoes he had for years, worn at the heels, the leather faded. His hands, once smooth from gliding over ivory keys, were now cracked and dry from soap, water, and chemicals. But none of that mattered to him. Not really. Because at the end of every long day, waiting for him back at their 1-bedroom apartment, was the reason he kept going, Lena. She was 8 years old, all heart and light, with curious eyes that always asked more than her mouth ever did. She didn't complain about their small home or the fact that they didn't have cable or that they wore second-hand clothes. She adored her father. To her, he was a giant. Not because of the money he didn't have, but because of the love he gave so freely, even when he had nothing left for himself. Every night, Marcus would bring home a story from the restaurant, not about the food or the guests, but about something funny a waiter said, or how the oven broke again. Lena would listen like it was the most exciting thing in the world. Then they'd share leftovers from the restaurant, laugh at cartoons, and fall asleep with the sound of city traffic outside their window. In the restaurant, Marcus had long learned how to shrink himself to avoid the eyes of those who judged too quickly. He noticed the way some patrons barely looked at the servers, much less him. Sometimes they'd glance toward the kitchen door and wrinkle their noses as if hard work had a smell. He never responded. He never defended himself. He just kept his head down and scrubbed another plate. The waitstaff appreciated him. They knew he was the reason things ran smoothly in the back. When others called in sick or left halfway through a shift, Marcus stayed. When the drain backed up or a server dropped a full tray of dishes, he never hesitated. But even they didn't know much about him. They never asked where he went after work, or why he never joined them for drinks. He wasn't rude, just quiet. Private. What most of them didn't know was that every extra shift he picked up, every overtime hour he logged, every tip someone slipped him for helping out, it all went to Lena. Her school books. Her clothes. The tiny savings jar marked, birthday. Her birthday was coming up in a few days. Marcus had been planning something special. Nothing extravagant. Just something that felt different. A small table at the restaurant during a quiet hour. A cupcake he'd bake himself in the staff oven. Maybe, if he could arrange it, someone could play a song on the piano in the dining room. Lena loved the sound of the piano. She said it made her feel like she was dreaming while awake. He hadn't told her yet. He wanted it to be a surprise. She didn't know that he'd already spoken to the manager and asked if he could quietly reserve a table in the corner during the lull between lunch and dinner. The manager, a kind but busy woman named Sarah, had agreed. Just make sure it's quick, Marcus. You know how things get around here. He had nodded, grateful. She didn't need to know how much that meant to him. To everyone else, he was just a dishwasher. But to Lena, he was the world. And to Marcus, that was more than enough. Marcus had been saving every spare dollar for months. He kept a glass jar in the kitchen cabinet behind the cereal boxes, out of Lena's reach and out of sight. It was labeled with a strip of masking tape and a single word written in permanent marker, birthday. It wasn't a secret out of shame, but out of hope. Hope that when the day finally came, he could give his daughter a memory that would outshine the quietness of their everyday lives. Lena's 8th birthday was coming up fast. Every day she added another X to the calendar with her favorite purple marker, counting down like it was the launch of a space mission. She never asked for much. She didn't beg for toys, or tablets, or big celebrations like other kids at school. She had learned early that their life was different. Quieter. More careful. And still, she never looked at her father with anything less than admiration. Marcus remembered what birthdays had once meant in their household. Back when her mother was alive, there had been balloons taped to the walls of their small living room, homemade banners, paper crowns, and off-key singing over slightly crooked cakes. Even when the illness crept in and drained all the color from their lives, Lena's mother had insisted on celebrating. One day, she whispered to Marcus during her last birthday with them, "You'll do it without me. Just promise me you'll make her feel like she matters." He had promised. Now, that promise weighed heavy in his chest, but also lit a fire inside him. This year, he wouldn't let the day pass like any other. He wouldn't let it be another quiet evening with hand-me-down toys and flickering birthday candles in the dark. No, this year, he wanted her to feel like a princess, at least for an hour. He'd spoken to Sarah, the restaurant manager, 2 weeks in advance. He asked if Lena could come in during the slow hour between the lunch rush and dinner crowd. Just one table in the corner. He'd work the early shift, then slip into a clean shirt and meet his daughter at the door. Sarah had hesitated, but finally agreed. "As long as it's quiet, and she doesn't disturb anyone," she said. Marcus had nodded quickly, not wanting to push further. The plan was simple. He'd pick up Lena from school with her favorite sunflower hair clips in his pocket. They'd walk to the restaurant, and he'd surprise her with a little table set just for her. A single pink balloon he managed to buy from the dollar store would be tied to her chair. In his backpack, he would carry a carefully packed cupcake, made that morning in the staff kitchen when no one was looking. No fancy bakery frosting, just love, patience, and vanilla icing from a jar. But the centerpiece of it all, the part Marcus prayed would come together, was the music. Lena loved the piano more than anything. She didn't just hear it, she felt it, the way some children feel sunlight or water. She could sit for hours on YouTube, watching old black and white videos of classical pianists, memorizing how their fingers moved, how the keys seemed to sing under their touch. Her favorite song was Beethoven's Für Elise, though she always called it the song with the pretty beginning. Marcus hadn't touched a piano in years. Not since he sold his own upright model to help cover hospital bills. But the restaurant had one. A grand piano, glossy and black, sitting unused most nights near the bar. Occasionally, a hired pianist would come in on weekends and play light jazz during dinner service. Marcus had asked Sarah if that pianist could come in early on Lena's birthday and play a song or two. She said she'd check. Each day that followed, Marcus worked with even more focus, more energy. He stayed late to help prep for the next day, swept up without being asked, and took extra shifts when coworkers called in. Every little bit helped. When a customer once left a $5 tip on the dish counter after noticing how quickly he cleaned up a dropped tray, Marcus tucked it straight into the jar. He didn't tell Lena about the plan. He wanted it to be magic. He wanted her to walk into the restaurant, see the little table set up with her name on it, and feel, for once, like the world had remembered her. Like it had carved out space just for her joy. She wouldn't know about the hours he spent cleaning floors until his knees ached. She wouldn't see the grocery lists where he replaced items with cheaper options to make room for that one balloon. She wouldn't know that her cupcake came from dough he mixed at 5 a.m., using ingredients he asked to borrow from the kitchen. All she would know, he hoped, was that her father had kept his promise. The afternoon of Lena's birthday arrived with quiet sunlight and the hint of spring in the air. Marcus had finished his morning shift early, wiping sweat from his brow and checking the clock more times than he cared to admit. Everything was in place. The small table had been set in the corner, away from the clatter of the kitchen doors and the footsteps of servers. A single pink balloon floated gently above a chair. The cupcake rested on a dessert plate, carefully unboxed and topped with a flickering candle. It wasn't grand, but it was special. And for Marcus, that was enough. Lena entered the restaurant with wide eyes and the bright yellow clips in her braids shining like rays of sunshine. Her eyes sparkled the moment she spotted the balloon. Her small hands clutched his tightly, and she whispered a soft, "Is this all for me?" Marcus nodded, and she grinned with the kind of happiness that lit up a room. For a few moments, time slowed. She sat at her table like royalty, giggling softly when a passing waitress placed a cloth napkin in her lap. The other staff smiled at the sight, some nodding in quiet recognition, some softly whispering how sweet it was. In that corner of the restaurant, everything felt perfect. But perfection has a way of drawing attention. And not all attention is kind. A group of wealthy guests entered just as Lena was about to blow out her candle. They were regulars, well-dressed, loud, and known for treating the staff like servants in a palace. They made no effort to soften their words or lower their voices. To them, money was power, and everyone else was background. The moment they spotted the child at the table, their expression soured. One of the women, wearing oversized sunglasses and a dripping designer handbag, wrinkled her nose as if the air had changed. Her companion, a man in a navy blazer who always ordered without looking at the menu, gestured toward the table with a smirk and muttered something under his breath. Then came the laughter. It started soft, then sharpened, mocking, bitter. One of them pointed to the cupcake and said loudly, "Is this a charity event now? They letting the help bring their kids in to play fancy?" Lena heard it. Her smile faltered for just a moment. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained still, frozen between fury and heartbreak. He had asked for one small corner. One moment for his daughter. And still, even that was seen as too much. The group didn't stop there. Another guest leaned toward a server and asked, "Who approved this? I don't pay $40 for steak to dine next to someone's birthday party for their maid's kid." The server, visibly uncomfortable, simply murmured and moved on. Then the piano started. Sarah, the manager, had kept her promise. The pianist had arrived early, slipping into his seat without fanfare. His fingers found the keys, and the soft, familiar melody of "For Elise" floated into the air. Lena's face lit up once more. Her hands went to her chest as if to hold the music in her heart. The laughter at the other table quieted. They turned toward the piano with confused expressions, unsure of what was happening. One of the guests called out, "Can someone turn that off? I didn't order ambience with my meal." But the pianist kept playing, undeterred. The music was not for them. For Lena, it was everything. Her eyes closed, and her body swayed slightly to the melody. It was as if she had been lifted out of the restaurant entirely, carried by the notes to a place where mockery and judgment could not reach her. But not everyone saw it that way. The man in the navy blazer snapped his fingers for a server, demanding that the child be removed from the dining area. "This is a fine establishment," he sneered. "Not a daycare. If he wants to throw a party, he can do it outside, where it belongs." Sarah arrived quickly, drawn by the rising voices. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on Marcus, who stood beside his daughter like a wall of quiet dignity. For a brief moment, she hesitated, caught between business and conscience. Then she turned to the guests and simply said, "She's not disturbing anyone. Your food will be out shortly." They weren't satisfied. They never were. One of them muttered something about leaving a review. Another took out their phone as if to document the offense. But the music played on, and Lena never stopped smiling. Marcus, though, felt something shift inside him. Something deep and painful. He had known shame before. He had swallowed pride more times than he could count. But this cruelty, so casual and public, was different. They hadn't just insulted him, they had tried to dim his daughter's joy. And for that, something inside him refused to stay silent. He said nothing in that moment. But the seed of defiance had been planted. The laughter had faded, but the sting lingered. Marcus could see it in Lena's eyes, the way they searched his face, questioning but trusting, unsure if something was wrong but believing that if her father stood tall, then everything must still be okay. He smiled back at her, a soft curve of reassurance, even though a storm brewed beneath his ribs. The guests had gone quiet, preoccupied with their appetizers and self-importance. But their words still echoed in the corners of Marcus's mind. They had turned a moment of beauty into something that needed defending. They saw his daughter's joy as a disruption, his love as an inconvenience. Still, Lena had not cried. She had listened to her favorite song with awe, and that, he told himself, mattered more than anything. When the music ended, a gentle hush fell over the room. Lena clapped softly, her small hands not demanding attention but offering gratitude. The pianist smiled from behind the keys and gave a slight nod. He began to pack up, his hour complete, but the energy he left behind hummed in the air. As Lena picked at the frosting on her cupcake, she asked the question Marcus had been waiting for, "Can I play something too?" It wasn't the first time she had asked, but it was the first time in a room full of strangers. Her fingers were already twitching, excited and a little unsure, like they were remembering every note she had seen on screen, every key she had memorized with her eyes and ears alone. Marcus hesitated. The piano wasn't a toy, and this wasn't their living room floor with the keyboard drawn in chalk on cardboard. But before he could speak, the pianist who had been preparing to leave turned back. He had overheard Lena's question and looked down at her with kind eyes. "She knows how to play?" he asked, without judgment or sarcasm. Marcus cleared his throat. "She's never had lessons. But, she's always listening." The pianist paused, then slowly stepped aside from the bench, motioning toward the keys. "Let her try." Lena's face lit up with disbelief, then wonder. She stood carefully, walking toward the piano like it was sacred ground. Her fingers hovered over the keys before she even sat, as if they already knew the way. No one had to explain anything. She didn't ask which note was which. She simply took a deep breath, and played. The first notes came hesitantly, not out of fear but reverence. Then, as her fingers moved with growing confidence, the melody unfolded, recognizable and gentle. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. It was honest. It was the sound of a child who had never touched a piano before but had memorized every rise and fall, every pause and flourish, from hours of watching others do what she dreamed of. The restaurant fell silent. Servers stopped mid-step. Diners lifted their heads. Even the table of rich guests looked up, momentarily robbed of their complaints. The girl they had scoffed at, the one they dismissed as a nuisance, now commanded the room with nothing but her hands and a tune she carried in her soul. Marcus didn't move. He hardly breathed. This was the moment. The hidden talent, the light he had always seen in her, was now undeniable. It wasn't just music, it was clarity. His daughter had taken all the ugliness in the room and answered it with beauty. She didn't raise her voice or demand to be seen. She simply played. When the final note drifted into silence, there was a pause. Then, a smattering of applause. Soft at first, but growing. Not out of obligation, but wonder. Even the pianist who had given up his seat stood still, his arms crossed, lips parted slightly in disbelief. He had seen prodigies before, but rarely children who learned by nothing but heart. Lena looked up at her father, her eyes wide with nervous pride, as if unsure whether what she'd done was allowed. Marcus nodded slowly, and for the first time that day, his throat tightened not from shame, but from overwhelming love. One of the diners approached the piano with cautious curiosity. "She learned that, on her own?" Marcus simply nodded. The man didn't scoff. He didn't laugh. He just stared at Lena for a moment, then back at the keys, as if realizing that he had just witnessed something impossible. From that day forward, everything began to change. The seed that had been planted earlier, of quiet defiance, of dignity held in silence, had now taken root. The rich guests had tried to reduce them to a spectacle. But Lena had shown them that grace could not be bought or silenced. Talent, it turned out, did not come wrapped in designer clothes or reserved tables. Sometimes, it lived in the fingers of a child whose world had been shaped by loss, love, and a cardboard keyboard drawn with crayons. Sometimes, true brilliance waited quietly, until the world had no choice but to listen. Word of the little girl who played Beethoven by ear spread faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, whispers circled among the restaurant staff, the local patrons, and even a few of the rich regulars who couldn't stop replaying the moment in their minds. Some dismissed it as a fluke, an accident, something rehearsed. But others, especially those who had truly listened, couldn't ignore what they had witnessed. Sarah, the manager, received a few calls from diners asking who the child was. A music teacher from a nearby conservatory had been at the restaurant that evening and left his card, scrawling a note that read, "Please contact me, this child has something extraordinary." One of the regulars, an older woman who had always eaten in silence and tipped the servers generously, sent a letter addressed to Marcus through the restaurant's front desk. In it, she wrote that Lena had reminded her of her late granddaughter, and she wanted to help in any way she could. Marcus, unused to attention, remained cautious. He knew how the world could lift someone up one day only to tear them down the next. But as the days passed, it became clear this wasn't a passing fascination. Something had shifted in people's perception. What had once been invisible, his daughter's brilliance, was now undeniable. And that recognition, fragile and rare, opened doors Marcus never thought to knock on. The music teacher who left his card came by the restaurant one afternoon, introducing himself with a calm demeanor and a promise that he wasn't looking to exploit anything. He'd seen raw talent before, but rarely in children who had no access to instruments, let alone formal training. He offered Lena free lessons at his studio. Not as a favor, but as an investment in potential that he believed was worth nurturing. Marcus hesitated, pride and gratitude wrestling within him. But Lena's face, alight with quiet hope, made the decision clear. She began weekly lessons, and the teacher quickly confirmed what the piano had already revealed: Lena was a natural. She could replicate complex compositions after hearing them once or twice. She remembered timing, structure, and emotion without sheet music. Most remarkable of all, she played not just with skill but with feeling, as if every note carried a piece of her own story. The transformation was slow but profound. The same diners who once ignored Marcus now greeted him by name. A few even asked after Lena, offering praise not just for her talent but for how she carried herself, with grace beyond her years. Some of the staff, once skeptical or indifferent, treated Marcus with new respect. No one mocked the balloon anymore. No one questioned why a janitor's daughter had been allowed to sit at a table. The rich guests who had first ridiculed Lena grew uncomfortably quiet whenever her name came up. A few avoided eye contact altogether. One of them, the man in the navy blazer, tried to pass off his earlier remarks as a misunderstanding. But the memory lingered, and while Marcus never confronted him directly, he no longer bowed his head in their presence. As Lena progressed in her lessons, the music teacher arranged for her to perform at a small local recital. It was a modest event, no red carpets, no flashing cameras, but it was her first time playing on a real stage before an audience who had come to listen. When she finished her piece, the standing ovation lasted longer than the performance itself. A few people in the crowd wiped away tears. Others simply looked stunned, realizing they had just witnessed the early bloom of something rare. After the recital, a woman approached Marcus with a proposal. She ran a foundation that supported gifted children from underprivileged backgrounds. She wanted to sponsor Lena's education, provide her with a proper piano, and connect her with musicians who could mentor her growth. There were no strings attached. Just an acknowledgement that talent like Lena's didn't come along often, and it deserved every chance to thrive. Marcus, who had always carried the weight of every decision alone, suddenly found himself part of a wider circle of people who genuinely wanted to help. It wasn't charity. It was recognition. The world had finally stopped looking at his clothes, his job, or his modest lifestyle, and started seeing the father who had nurtured brilliance with nothing but love and cardboard keys. The turning point wasn't just Lena's performance. It was the realization, shared by everyone who had once judged them, that true value couldn't be measured by wealth or status. It was something deeper, quieter, and often hidden behind appearances that people were too busy or too proud to look past. For Marcus, it was never about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about his daughter having the freedom to be seen, not as a janitor's child, not as a novelty, but as herself. And in that, they had already won more than he ever dared to imagine. The months that followed carried a quiet, powerful momentum that neither Marcus nor Lena could have foreseen. Each day brought new challenges, but also new victories, small moments of triumph that gradually reshaped their world. What had once been a place where judgment and scorn were common now hummed with respect, hope, and the gentle hum of possibility. Lena's fingers grew stronger, more confident. The notes that once stumbled through her memory now flowed effortlessly. She began composing her own melodies, weaving fragments of her life, joy, struggle, love, and resilience, into music that touched everyone who heard it. Her talent was no longer a secret or a curiosity, it was a gift that brought people together, reminding them that greatness often rises from the most unexpected places. Marcus watched with pride that was sometimes hard to contain. He remembered the nights when money was tight, when exhaustion threatened to steal his spirit, when he questioned whether the world would ever see past his worn clothes and tired hands. Now, standing beside Lena at recitals and music classes, he saw how far they had come, not because the world had changed entirely, but because they refused to be defined by its narrow expectations. The guests who had once sneered now avoided their path or offered awkward smiles that Marcus no longer needed to ignore. He had learned something far more important than their approval. He had learned that dignity wasn't something given by others, it was something claimed and held firm in the face of doubt. That lesson, he knew, was the one he would pass on to Lena every day. One afternoon, as Marcus helped Lena pack her music books into a worn backpack, she looked up and said something that caught him by surprise. "Daddy," she said, her voice steady and certain, "I want to teach others. Kids like me who think they're invisible." Marcus felt a swell in his chest. It wasn't just her talent that amazed him, it was her heart, her desire to lift others even as she rose herself. She wasn't content to be a success story for others to admire. She wanted to be a beacon, a bridge for those still waiting to be seen. That moment crystallized everything. The journey they had taken, from a birthday party in the corner of a restaurant to recitals and sponsorships, was not just about music or recognition. It was about breaking cycles of judgment and invisibility. It was about proving that everyone deserved a chance to shine, regardless of how the world labeled them. Marcus realized that the true victory was not in silencing the cruel voices or changing the opinions of the rich guests. It was in the transformation of his own family story, from one of quiet survival to one of bold, undeniable presence. The lessons learned in those painful, humiliating moments were the foundation of something stronger, love that refused to be diminished, hope that refused to be silenced. As Lena's music blossomed, so did their relationship. The bond forged through hardship grew into an unbreakable partnership. Together, they faced the world with open eyes and open hearts. They understood that appearances were only the surface, and beneath them lay stories waiting to be told, stories of strength, kindness, and unexpected brilliance. In the end, the world did change for Marcus and Lena, not because the rich guests learned to be kind or because the restaurant became a stage for grand performances. It changed because they chose to redefine what it meant to be worthy. Their story became a quiet revolution against prejudice and judgment. The powerful lesson remained clear: never judge a book by its cover, because true worth is found in the unseen places, in the courage to keep going, in the talent nurtured in silence, in the love that lifts you above hate. And in that truth, Marcus and Lena found freedom. They had proven that sometimes the greatest surprises come from those we least expect, and that when respect replaces judgment, the world becomes a far richer place for everyone.